in their bipartisan efforts to combat China are Democratic Congressman Krishnamoorthi of Illinois and Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, who is also the ranking member and chairman, respectively, of the House Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. A lot to discuss on China, but first let's talk about the summit that is happening. I mean, is there anything that the United States can do besides, the White House issuing these warnings to stop what appears to be this arms deal in the making?
Well, I think the first thing is just recognize the basic geopolitical reality, which is that increasingly we have an axis of authoritarian countries arrayed against our interests, not just the United States, but all of our allies and partners. Obviously, China is the dominant partner. Vladimir Putin is the junior partner, but it includes North Korea, it includes Iran, it includes countries like Venezuela. And so we don't have the luxury of sort of ignoring certain parts of the world. We need to have a global strategy. We need to be engaged. We need to be in the business of recruiting our own allies and partners, because we actually have the luxury of having capable, competent allies and partners, a network of alliances that we've built painstakingly over the last few decades. That's really a unique source of strength we have relative to China.
Yeah, but we see how they are obviously being pushed closer and closer together, growing closer. I mean, how worried are you about the Putin and Kim alliance that we're seeing?
I'm concerned, but at the same time, as you mentioned before, I think it is a sign of desperation on the part of Putin. He knows that things aren't going as well as he'd like in Ukraine, and we've seen some recent momentum, maybe some breakthroughs through the defensive lines of the Russians. And at the same time, the North Koreans are very desperate. They need food, they need energy. But what they're going to supply aren't necessarily the best artillery shells in the world. Published reports show that a lot of this stuff doesn't even reach its intended targets, which tells me that, both sides are desperate. And so although we want to treat this appropriately, and he is breaking sanctions by potentially selling arms to Russia, I think that we don't want to overreact either.
But will there be consequences for breaking those sanctions? I mean, or just seeing that this is this desperate act?
I think there should be. Certainly, we can do a better job of enforcing our existing sanctions regime, potentially expanding it where necessary. One thing we've contemplated for years, which should be on the table, we're talking about North Korea, Russia, but traditionally, North Korea gets an economic lifeline from China, and secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and businesses that abet the North Koreans' regime's destabilizing behavior, I think, should be on the table going forward.
Obviously, China borders both Russia and North Korea. President Xi has also been forging ties with both of these countries. He has not yet, based on what we know, and tell me if that's different, supplied arms to Russia to use in Ukraine. What do you think he makes of what we're watching play out with this slow train moving there?
I think he probably has some concerns as well. He wants to know probably what is being given in return for the arms that are being supplied to Russia, because remember, the North Koreans want certain nuclear technology as well as satellite technology, which the Chinese have been very reluctant to provide to them. And I presume that they wouldn't want the Russians to provide that either to the North Koreans. So I think he'll be watching that carefully. So far, the Chinese themselves have not supplied lethal aid to the conflict, but we want to watch that very, very carefully as well.
Yeah, and I should note the reason that we're here is you are here in New York meeting with financial leaders, kind of working through these so-called war games on the risks of what China invading Taiwan, what that could look like. I mean, what's your message to them? What are you saying to them?
Well, to connect it to our previous topic, Korea, obviously in China, there's a cult of the Korean War that's popped up recently. The highest grossing Chinese movie of all time is a movie about the Korean War. And I think it's part of a preparation by Xi Jinping to prepare his country for conflict with the West. So what we need to be signaling in no uncertain terms is that an attempted PLA invasion of Taiwan, A, would fail, and B, would be met with a united response from the West. The consequences of taking such a destabilizing action, the consequences of undermining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait would be catastrophic for Xi Jinping. And that's another lesson of Ukraine, right? Obviously, deterrence initially failed in Ukraine. The cost has been enormous. We need to ensure that Taiwan's future doesn't become Ukraine's present by doing things like arming Taiwan with Harpoon missiles, replenishing our stockpiles of long-range precision fires, and doing what we tried to interrogate earlier today, which is what are the financial and economic levers we can pull now in order to put ourselves in a more advantageous position, again, with the overall focus of deterring a war with China, which would be catastrophic.
China has been having a ton of economic issues back at home. And President Biden, when he was just wrapping up his trip in Vietnam, he was asked if he thought that would deter them from, or make it more likely that they would move on Taiwan. He said no. Is that something is that an assessment you agree with? Or do you think it could make someone who is very risk averse less risk averse?
Potentially. I mean, if Xi Jinping thought his economic back was against the wall and he didn't think that he could repair what's happening in China, which is a dismal economic situation, it's quite possible he could resort to the nationalism card. And that would be very dangerous, as you know. It would be a horrible day for the world were an open conflict to happen over Taiwan. And so Mike is right that we have to do everything we can to deter that from happening. At the same time, we need to work with our partners and friends and allies in the region to weave an economic partnership as well that makes it more likely that China will actually play by the rules of the road economically and not just militarily, because as you know, they engage in dumping, cyber theft, intellectual property theft, and other types of moves that really hurt our economy. The last point is, unfortunately, a lot of American dollars through investments in Chinese companies actually fuel crackdown on human rights in China, as well as a buildup of the PLA. You know, the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, which Mike and I are a member of, actually has index funds in it that are invested in companies that provide surveillance equipment for the Uyghur genocide, also aircraft engines and parts.
And when you bring that up with those industry leaders, what do they say?
Well, basically they say, first of all, it's in our fiduciary duty to actually be investing in these things, which is completely ridiculous. I don't think it's in the best interest of federal employees to be investing in these types of companies. And then secondly, it's up to us in Congress also to legislate to make sure this doesn't happen. So this is one of the reasons why we're here to talk about this, to explore what needs to be done, and to prevent us from fueling or funding, you know, the very things that we don't want to have happen in China.
Is that message breaking through? What's the response been?
I think so. I think even the asset managers or bankers on Wall Street who have a more dovish position on China than I do or we do recognize they could live with a more aggressive set of restrictions so long as there was predictability, so long as we legislated a solution that transcended this administration or the next. So we're not ping-ponging back and forth between different executive orders or different regulation. And if there was an appropriate transition period, a glide path to the new rules, I think even people who don't have the view of the CCP threat that we do could live with that reality, which is why it's up to us to step up and legislate a solution. And the final thing I'd say is, though reasonable people can disagree about where to draw the line for economic engagement with China, I don't think anyone can defend the idea that we should be allowing American retirees to invest in Chinese military companies that are building things designed to kill Americans in a future conflict.
Congressman, it's an important bipartisan issue clearly to both of you, so thank you both for joining me on set tonight.
Thank you.